Hello, and welcome to another episode of YPO Presents. I'm Ekaterina Walter, Marketing Director at YPO, and today we're speaking with a YPO member and Adaptive Edge founder, Scott Zimmerman, about cultivating and maintaining trust in times of crisis. Now, in addition to founding Adaptive Edge, Scott is also an advisor, author, a performance coach dedicated to CEOs and executive teams who are hungry to achieve more with less wasted effort. As the three-time chief executive, Scott has created nearly $1 billion US dollars in organic shareholder value, won GE's Imagination Breakthrough Award, and his organization has won numerous best in industry recognitions. Now, throughout his career, as well as in his work with YPO, Scott created frameworks and practices to scale trust across stakeholders. And that's what we will be focusing on our discussion today. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We're glad you're with us today. Now, before we get started, we'd like to remind all of you watching live to ask our guest questions by posting them in the comment section below. And if you're not following us already, please do so you can receive notifications when our next episode begins. Now, today, we're talking about cultivating and maintaining trust in times of crisis. Now, Scott, how do you define trust in business?
Yeah, I think it's important to start by delineating the difference between trustworthiness and trust. Trustworthiness is really a leader's assessment of someone's credibility, their reliability, their sincerity, and the motives they bring to the relationship. But authentic trust isn't a static assessment. It's dynamic. It's an ongoing practice. It's the choice to rely and depend on each other, including the risk of betrayal. So it's really around two commitments that I see inside of organizations. The first being, are we making and keeping meaningful promises to each other? And the second being, are we giving transparent feedback through the inevitable disappointments along the journey? So trust is really about the quality of the bond that we've developed in our relationship. And if it were a measurement, it would be a measurement of how much we feel like we can count on each other.
I love that answer, right? Because the whole idea of connecting the dots of our sort of behavior, right? It kind of bleeds into what your brand is, right? Or how your company is perceived, how your leadership is perceived. So on that note, what's a meaningful way, right? Let's get straight to the heart of it. What is one meaningful way for global executives to build employee trust or customer trust for that matter? And within those two, do the approaches differ with different stakeholders? Are they the same? What are the key principles, Scott?
Yeah. Well, I think the most meaningful approach, they're mostly the same, right? Because people are people. We don't have to spend a lot of time convincing people about the importance of trust. YPO, we did a survey. It says 96% of CEOs believe that trust is a vital priority to their success. But when we talk about trust, that's easy. Doing trust isn't easy because it involves personal change and taking risks. And as a leader, you're either choosing to take the risk and trust or you aren't. And so each time leaders choose to trust, they're building it. In my experience, there are kind of two fundamentals that people should be thinking about. I think at an organizational level, you really need to build an organization that has a strong moral foundation for trust. And that's really about four things, like, do we tell the truth? Do we keep our promises? Do we treat each other with respect? And do we treat each other with fairness? And in one of the organizations that I led, when I entered the business, there was really a lack of trust between leaders, employees, customers, and shareholders. And one of the areas we focused on as a leadership team was creating a new set of values for the organization in three areas. The first being permission to play values. These were values that if you didn't live them, you didn't work here anymore. And for us, those were about respect and integrity, which to us meant doing what was right, including leaving the right impression. We had aspirational values, areas where we felt like we needed to focus in order to grow. And one of those was about getting better at making and keeping promises to ourselves and our customers. And then we really looked at core values, which is things that really embody what the pride and the business legacy that existed before, which is really a deep caring for customers. And I think as people in the organization began to see us hire and fire based on values like, are you living the value of integrity and respect? Employees saw that our values weren't just something that was on a wall. that we really had this moral and foundation infused in, and people started mirroring those changes. And I think when customers saw us amplifying this idea of making and keeping our promises and being transparent and truth telling, we saw customer satisfaction improve as well.
Well, so let's unpack a couple of those things. So fairness, right? I think there's misunderstanding around what fairness really means when it comes to leading your business as well as leading your employees and communicating with a variety of different stakeholders. So talk to us a little bit about that. What does that mean, and what are some examples of how maybe a company, you've seen a number of companies you worked with, applied it in sort of everyday business life?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I think all these things kind of work together, but fairness is about a consistency, with which we treat everybody, kind of one idea of fairness is that regardless of your level, best idea wins. Doesn't matter where that idea came from. Fairness is consistency in the way we treat people. It's the idea that we don't play favorites inside the organization. Fairness is about recognizing your organization's responsibility and potentially creating disruption for a customer, and accommodating them with credits, for the mistake that you made. So, I mean, those are all, simple examples with multiple stakeholders around living the value of fairness.
Is there, right now we're in this time where in this environment where employees probably feel insecure about their position in the company, potentially their role. Is there advice that you have for leaders, something very specific that they could do to communicate with their employees or do something to make them feel comfortable? Anything as far as building a nurture relationship with your employees at this time? Yeah,
when we kind of come back to those values, you look at what people are looking for, that, our relationships, kind of trust on a global level, a domestic level, locally or inside of a company isn't really where it needs to be, right? There's a lot of mistrust in government and the media. And I think what employees are looking for from their leaders is people that they can believe in, people that are transparent and really have their best interests at heart. And I think, leaders focusing on being more transparent is important. I think people are having a hard time with sense making right now, making sense of all the information that's available to them. And so I think leaders can really do themselves a favor by helping employees make sense of what's real, what's the objective truth, and really being transparent about the good news and the bad news, because people can handle it. Employees are looking for guidance on what you want them to do and how they can help. I mean, they understand there's existential risk going on right now. People are worried about their families, themselves or their families getting sick. Leaders of businesses are worried about their business's survival. And so we need to give people guidance on what we need them to do. And then we need to help people feel safe and give them a sense of hope. So I think, right now we've got a tremendous amount of shared concern in the environment. And this is an unbelievably unique and catalytic opportunity for companies to really come together and build more trust.
What about customers? So you hit on something, making promises, keeping promises. I think it applies to all kinds of stakeholders, right? Yeah. For customers specifically, what are your customers looking for? What do you think their expectation, besides you, sticking to your ethos and making and keeping promises? Is there anything that leaders need to specifically pay attention to?
Well, I like the idea of, really emphasizing connection. I mean, right now, customers are drowning in broadcast email communications from all the companies that they work with. And broadcast emails are valuable, but companies can do better. I mean, customers have an innate sense of the goodness of a team or a company, and whether your organization is really just self-interested or truly cares about what their challenges and concerns are. So I get excited about companies that want to signal their sincerity, that they want to signal their deep care. And it's one thing to say you care, but it's another thing for senior leaders to be setting aside time every week for one-on-one or small group conversations with customers and really being intentional about deepening that connection, asking about their situation, including challenges they may be having serving their customers, asking them specifically where they're challenged, what you might be able to share in terms of information or resources or do that could be meaningful to them. Where are they struggling with things that are outside of what you do, but you may be able to help with, like creating a connection to someone who can really help them. I also get excited about all these one-on-one interactions being an opportunity to find out how the company can do better. How can our company make life easier for you? And really creating the space for that input, affirming customers for sharing, taking that input seriously, and ensuring you circle back to tell customers how that feedback is informing the changes you make. Because I think when customers and even employees realize they have the power to influence you, and that you care about their concerns, then we're really building trust.
There's a question on LinkedIn from Carrie, and she's asking, what about scaling trust? Are there different challenges for small, medium, and large organizations? Is there any differences? Any advice?
Yeah, I think it's about our way of being. A lot of times when we just did a half-day scaling trust workshop inside of YPO in Orlando, and then we did another one in San Diego recently. And there are really kind of three things that I brought to the forefront as behavioral switches that I think leaders could make. The first one is that there's a power differential. There's a one up, one down power dynamic that exists between, let's say, the CEO of a company and the people that work for that company, because that CEO, for all intents and purposes, holds the security of that employee in their hands. And so, but the problem is that differential, that one up, one down power dynamic really gets in the way. So I like leaders to really practice a lot more self-disclosure and talking about their needs and concerns with employees and where they need help. Because when leaders act like they have it all together and they have all the answers, then they really keep that differential intact. But when they show employees that they have cares and concerns and needs for help, just like employees do, they shrink that differential, and we really see employees, lean into those disclosures. So I love that, number one. I think the second thing is we have to foster cultures where we're better at giving feedback and really being transparent about what we think and feel. When we have that differential in place and people are being deferential to that leader, so we have that difference in place, they're being deferential, what's really happening is we're really missing out on what employees have to say. And in a lot of organizations, employees have the answers that executives need to solve the problems that are in the organization. The leaders have lost access to those employees sharing that or their engagement in making things be successful. So getting really good at team disclosure, people getting more comfortable with that, and that requires a lot of courage, can be really important. And then I think we need to see leaders show up in a different way. I call it showing up in meetings or in interactions, not being closed, but really a shift to open. And what does that mean? From an open head standpoint, it means moving from certainty that we know we're right about what's wrong and what we should do it about, to being curious about what's really happened. From a closed heart to an open heart perspective, it's really about moving from judgment or blame, that we're disappointed, frustrated, or angry that things didn't go right, to being open to things not going right as an opportunity to deepen the relationship and learn together as a team so that we can be more successful moving forward. And then when I think about the closed hand, and the open hand, and the open hand is really about this notion that says the ideas of what we did in the past may have been right, but the environment might be different. How can we find new paths forward together so that there's a collective commitment from the people who need to do the work to really execute the strategy that's been decided upon. So those are three things that come out for me. And I don't think it's different regardless of the organization, because at the end of the day, it's about our behaviors, and scaling trust is really about how do we interact in every interaction with a team or an individual.
I love that you touched on the power of vulnerability and humanity, right? At the end of the day, we're all just people, we're all dealing with very similar challenges, and there's a power to you leaders being vulnerable. I love personally Marriott CEO message to the employees, right? And how publicly and how publicly and honestly openly, right? He talked about the current situation. So 3 months ago, YPO surveyed over 2,900 of its members, global chief executives, about this very subject, trust. And 96% of the respondents said that they rate building and maintaining trust with stakeholders as a high priority. Now, do you see this number change considering the current environment? Will trust become a necessity or an empty mission statement during tough times? What is your thought on that?
Well, I think whether it's an empty notion depends on the CEO. It depends on whether we keep it front and center in organizations. I mean, I don't see this data changing. This data was taken before the pandemic was occupying our attention today, so it's not going to be any less important. I think the idea of the heroic leader at the top is an antiquated one. No leader can be successful alone. And I think the cordial, polite harmony that I see in the organizations I work with every day is literally eating away at employee souls. Leaders and teams pretend to trust, but the reality is they hold back their ideas, they hold back their feedback, they hold back their criticism from senior leaders. They go along with plans they know won't work. And while they're logging hours, they're not bringing their full enthusiasm and taking meaningful risks in the face of challenges at work. And I think in today's global and hyper-competitive markets, businesses are going to need more speed and agility. And so I think leaders and teams need and want to be able to count on each other. But wanting it is different than actually achieving it. So I think leaders have to go back to this idea of building a strong moral foundation for the truth-telling, the promise-keeping, the respect and fairness. I think if those are present and people start seeing the leaders walk that talk, and leaders really look themselves in the mirror and their behavioral choices and say, how are my choices impacting trust? Then I think they can get really intentional about upgrading how much they pay attention to promise making and keeping, and how much they're paying attention to fostering more transparency and truth telling in their organizations.
There's a question that Tori is asking on LinkedIn. What are some of the things that you are seeing from leadership today, from a company, government entity, or any other institution that is successful? And where are areas for improvement for them? So basically, who does it well? Any specific examples? Who does it poorly? Why?
Well, I think the people who are doing it well are very intentional about it. I would say it's an opportunity in every organization that I work with. There are trust issues between executives on the senior team, and issues between the executives and the CEOs. Issues between the CEO and boards. And I think a lot of emotional behaviors that we see when things aren't going well are just a reflection of how sophisticated people are and being able to deal with their emotions, and how willing they are to be courageous to have transparent conversations. So I think we could probably look around and see people. I guess the people I get excited about are the people who are starting to lean in, and this is becoming a more central conversation. They're willing to practice, delivering feedback to each other. And a lot of times we can kind of navigate that in the room with people that are uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, this is a little bit like an emotional bank account. And so you don't arrive at kind of having perfect trust inside of an organization. You got to work at it every day. So in every interaction, we're either building trust or destroying trust. And what are we doing to create those deposits inside the emotional bank account? We talk about this notion of providing feedback. I mean, I love the idea of not only getting simple with our feedback. We talk about an SBI model. What's the situation? What's the observable behavior? And what was the impact it had on me and our relationship? I think we need to get it really simple, but I also get excited about leaders who are willing to ask people they just gave feedback to say, in my sharing, what helped build trust between me and you, and what might have gotten in the way of trust? Because it's a way for us to calibrate it. We're really trying to develop this bond between one another. And I think if leaders would come to increasingly understand that it's really about the quality of the relationship that we have with each other that determines how much commitment we have to making and keeping promises to each other in the face of obstacles and setbacks.
To follow up on that comment, what specific behaviors should organizations avoid to be able to maintain the trust that they work so hard to create, right? So any specific things that you can recommend looking out for?
Yeah, well, I think those emotional responses, those knee-jerk responses that can kind of become a historical pattern. I mean, I see kind of two behaviors that are, not helpful on the trust journey. The first one is when we have those types of responses and we kind of rail on somebody for falling short. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really getting in the way of the relationship. And I think the second one is this idea of holding back. There are a lot of leaders that are holding back. It's hard to be transparent because we don't have a lot of confidence in our ability to deliver it well or for people to receive it well. We think matters will be worse. But the problem is when we disclose, we're building trust in the organization, regardless of how it goes. And when we hold back, we're really kind of destroying trust. So I think, really looking at whether we're leaning in, being courageous and sharing our concerns. And I think we have to share concerns in a specific way. I think if we share our concerns from a place of wanting to be right, that's where we really get into issues. When we think about sharing feedback with somebody, we want to get simple and clear. But I think it starts with we want to have an exploration around our concern, not about being right. It's not about being right. I want to explore my concern together. Is the first place I get excited about. And then I think it's really important when we're providing feedback to people, whether it's in a group session or individually, that they're really clear that we value the relationship and we're for their success. I think if you get those two things right, you're well on the way to being able to share feedback that helps to build and deepen the relationship through the setback that you just had.
I love the fact that the word feedback or creating feedback loop keeps coming into conversation. Super important, right? Because if you can't establish that with your stakeholders, there's going to be only one-sided conversation. So I love that you keep saying that and bringing this up because I feel like a lot of organizations might potentially miss that important caveat and not just get the feedback, but act on it. So for organizations that need help,
Can I jump in there? I think that's a really I think that's so interesting because it's super important to understand that we all have a different set of life experiences and we all sit in the organization in a different chair. And so I get excited about the fact that none of us, there's a Japanese proverb, none of us is as smart as all of us. And sometimes the CEO has the broadest perspective, but they don't have as much depth as the people in the individual functional area or the people closest to the customer. So when we think about perspectives, I get excited about the idea of marrying breadth and depth so that we can put the most perspectives on the table and we can make the best decisions from those perspectives. And I think the second thing I wanted to say on what you mentioned was because we come from different places and because we see different things, in order for us to deepen our relationship, we have to constantly be calibrating with one another. So I think if we fall into this tendency of believing that our view of the world is right and we don't stay curious to what your view is in service to that relationship, which is the way we're most likely to get to our goals, then we're really missing an opportunity. So that's why the feedback piece is so important. It's about calibrating our relationship. It's about understanding each other.
Cannot agree more. Now, so if organizations are looking for help in getting started, Scott, what resources would you recommend for leaders to help them build and maintain trust within the organization and across the stakeholders?
Well, obviously, YPO.org /trust has a great resources page. So if people want to hear about the study, the CEO Pulse results that you alluded to, as well as some fantastic content that's put together on trust, that's one place I would go. I put something up for you all today. If you go out to adaptiveedges.com, which is my website /trust, you'll find a summary document from my half-day workshop that I've done with a lot of YPOers on scaling trust in the organization. And it really outlines 3 behavioral changes leaders need to begin to play with. And then I think for the readers out there in the audience, I would recommend Building Trust by Fernando Flores and The Outward Mindset by the Arbinger Institute.
That's fantastic. We have one more question from Daniel on LinkedIn. Market evaluations are down and the markets have a very sort of negative outlook. How do you see leaders maintaining investor trust when we can be 5 years away from a turnaround? There's uncertainty. Any particular methods you recommend?
I think people have to do what they need to do right now in organizations to kind of bulletproof the organization for the short term as best they can. And that's going to be a lot harder. We talk about manufacturing plants that, that need to shut down and they've got to start getting back up. I mean, there are going to be some significant issues for some companies here in the short term. Other companies are better positioned for remote. But I think this is an incredible time for people to kind of shift out of a short-term perspective once those things are buttoned down and really take a long-term look at how their business needs to transform to be more competitive and more agile moving forward. And so I get super interested in things that are foundational and fundamental. And I think trust is one of them. I mean, trust is a force multiplier in an organization. It's the one cultural thing that makes everything else get better. And if you really look at it, organizations are filled with all this brain power that's grotesquely underutilized because leaders fall into these patterns of using power and control and fear and blaming people when things go wrong. That's how they handle their personal frustration, their disappointments, their anxiety. But if leaders could start to prioritize deepening the relationships and the collective learning in their organization to help things go right for the future, they'd be better off. So what I see is that leaders who prioritize deepening trust, which doesn't take any more time, regardless of what's going on, this is an ideal time to be taking time to work on improving relationships. When the relationships in businesses improve, then people share more of what they think and feel. When people share more of what they think and feel, more perspectives, more creativity, more innovation emerges. When leaders have more information and more choices, they're more likely to make wiser decisions. When people are collectively informed and involved in that decision making, there's a greater collective coordination and commitment across the groups in the organization to making it successful. And when that coordination improves, people are more committed individually to taking the risks and fulfilling their promises. So we don't need a bunch of separate initiatives on innovation, employee engagement, accountability. This is the one thing that, if improved, raises all boats simultaneously.
And I think you just answered one of my last questions that I love to ask, and that is, what is one piece of advice that you would give global leaders around creating and nurturing trust, especially in such a challenging environment? You gave us a lot of tips, including your last answer. I think you provided us a lot of thought starters. Anything else you haven't had a chance to say that you think global leaders should be thinking about?
I just think, if you're really committed to this, it's really about sitting down and starting small. This isn't about some big initiative across the organization. Leaders would benefit from taking some time to reflect, to get really clear, where are the places where I have distrust, in my organization with members of my team, and how do I get more intentional about shining a light on that distrust? That's probably the fastest way to improve trust, is to identify the relationships where there's an opportunity, to understand what's stepping in the way, and to get into an exploration with that person about how we move forward productively together. And then I think beyond individual people, I think leaders have a real opportunity to choose to show up in meetings in different ways. I think it's important to have an agenda. I think it's important to get through our task list for the meeting, but I think we've over tilted on operational excellence and productivity, and we need to bring a lot more humanity back into the meeting. And that really starts with how leaders show up in group meetings. So those are the two places I would invite people into.
I love it. What a great closing, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for those who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, let us know by sharing it with your networks and subscribing to our channels. And until next time, this is YPO Presents.